Hello and welcome. My name is Cindy Heitzman, Executive Director for the California Preservation Foundation. We want to thank you for joining the second webinar in the California State Historical Building Code series entitled Accessibility and Historic Buildings. We will develop additional webinars on the use and application of the building codes to historic buildings and invite you to submit your recommendations for additional topics of interest. We also encourage you to become a member of the California Preservation Foundation and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. Information on membership can be found on our website at www.californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure the protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will include a presentation followed by time for question and answers. There's a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until the end for the presenter to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To hide or unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Please adjust your volume on your computer or phone. Today's presentation will be by Peyton Hall. Mr. Hall, FAIA, is Managing Principal of Historic Resources Group in Pasadena and Adjunct Professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California. He has a Bachelor's of Architecture degree from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Environmental Design from Yale University. Postgraduate studies were completed at the Center for Palladian Studies in Vicenza, Italy, and the Natural Cultural Properties Institute in Tokyo, Japan. Mr. Hall has completed a range of projects, including the Gamble House Conservation Project, the Historic Structures Report for Doris Duke's Shangri-La in Honolulu, to the current Rose Bowl renovation project. Peyton is a former president of the California Preservation Foundation and former chair of the Board of Directors of Pasadena Heritage. He is currently one of the 5 national advisors to the Historic Resources Committee of the American Institute of Architects, a member of the advisory committee to the Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, and a member of the Los Angeles Mayor's Design Advisory Panel. Thank you for joining us today, Peyton.
Thank you, Cindy, and good afternoon. I'm first of all a historic architect. I'm not a California accessibility specialist. I think we probably have the benefit of one of those among our group today. I will come back to some of the provisions for applicability of the California Historical Building Code later. But in the meantime, I'd like to start with something that really got my attention back in about 1992 when the legal counsel, as ADA was becoming a reality for the whole country, and of course we in California had our Title 24, made a very simple statement to a large group of people that accessibility is a higher moral imperative than historic preservation. And this was coming from our nation's historic preservation advocacy organization. So this is something that we as practitioners, of course, have come to maybe take for granted for the past 20 plus years, but something that remains very important and a challenge. And from my standpoint, this is issue spotting and solving problems for architects, owners, and builders, and how we do remove barriers and how we try to manage to keep our patrimony at the same time. We're basing this discussion on the California Code of Regulations, Title 24, Part 8, which is CHBC, the California Historical Building Code. I wrote this paragraph to make a point. It's maybe, of course, the facts are the facts. Qualitatively, I think there's been a tendency as newcomers get acquainted with CHBC that it's because it looks like a separate small code, that it's apart from what we do. It is actually a part of the California Building Code, An application is mandatory for all jurisdictions at the request of the applicant for qualified historical properties. I've heard the word trump a lot. Well, does regular code trump CHBC? Does ADA or ADAG trump CHBC? Well, no, this is all part and parcel of our state building code, and of course ADA is a legal and moral responsibility, and we try to resolve all of these things to the best effect. They're not apart from each other. In practice, they're part of the whole. The General Administrative Introduction to CHBC calls out that enforcing agencies need to accept solutions that are reasonably equivalent. That's in reference to all measures. The intent is to facilitate preservation and continuing use of qualified historical buildings or properties while providing reasonable safety for the building occupants and access for persons with disabilities. It's significant that in this introductory chapter that the state points out to us two major issues. One is safety, and the second is access. I pulled one paragraph that has general application to the code because I think it's really important for building officials, architects, and owners, and that is the paragraph on additional work. As we who practice always know, things are never simple and cut and dried, but in many instances, when it comes to regular codes provisions for existing buildings, we talk about triggers. If you do certain types of work, that triggers other work. Sometimes it's a type of work, or it may be a volume of work, a percentage of building value replaced, or a dollar value. It's really significant that under this paragraph it says that the qualified buildings for this code shall not be subject to additional work required by the regular code, regulation, or ordinance beyond that required to complete the work undertaken. Certain exceptions for accessibility and for distinct hazards exist by mandate and may require specific action within the parameters of the CBC. Which buildings, sites, objects, places, locations can apply Division 8? It's really quite broad. It's not, for example, just a landmark that's listed on a city, county, state, or federal register. It is, qualitatively speaking, deemed of importance to the history, architecture, or culture of an area by an appropriate local, state, or federal government jurisdiction. So there's more than one way that a building can be officially deemed of importance. Of course, it includes buildings and properties that are listed as a local landmark or in the California Register or the National Register, but it also could include buildings that have been determined eligible for officially those registers and those designations, as well as California Register of Historical Resources, state historical landmarks, state points of historical interest, city or county registers, inventories, or surveys. If your city has a survey where a particular building has been surveyed and determined eligible for your local landmarks designation, that is adequate. That's included. Under Chapter 8.6, focusing down on what we're mainly talking about today, the purpose of CHBC is to provide alternative regulations to facilitate access and use by persons with disabilities to and throughout facilities designated. These regulations require enforcing agencies to accept alternatives to regular code when dealing with qualified historical buildings or properties. I said earlier that I would make a reference to something that's not in the presentation, and we can come back to this in the Q&A. Thanks to a California accessibility specialist who looked at my presentation, I was reminded to point out that in this same Chbc code, Appendix A, there is, under the title Chapter 8-6, Table 1, Provision Applicability, that outlines under what circumstances and which provisions this applies, this being Chapter 8-6 and accessibility provisions under the Historic Code. And it's organized under columns that will be familiar to someone who's worked with ADA, and that is when these alternative provisions apply to Title II public entities, Title III private entities, or Title III barrier removal. I'm not here today to present the provision applicability, but to note in my experience, when you have something that's really well explicit, objectively rather, defined in ADAG or in Title 24 as to what a design guideline is, there is, before you get to that point, the question of, does this measure apply to my existing building or my historic building or not? And that's an important question to ask. If I have a two-story building, do I need to build an elevator or not? And I think those are very, very important and require study to understand when under what circumstances, if there's a rule or a threshold that requires accessibility, when does it apply? Accessibility, general application. The provisions apply to local, state, and federal governments, and here's the reference to Title II, Title III. And moving on, regular code. This is the code that would apply for accessibility under any new building or any existing building. Shall be applied to qualified historical buildings or properties unless strict compliance with the regular code will threaten or destroy historical significance or character-defining features of the building or property. Therefore, even if we apply CHBC, we are required to use regular code where we can. We want to remove barriers. We want to provide access. We want to conform to regular code unless there is a real issue of threatening or destroying historical significance and character-defining features. What does that mean? How do we know? And who makes that decision? There are many qualified agencies or public or private sector professionals who are familiar with determining significance and identification of character-defining features of a building. They are familiar with the application of the standards for the treatment of historic properties, which is cross-referenced in Appendix A. The guidelines, preservation briefs. Ultimately, a public agency, when deciding that you can have an alternative measure that's not the regular code, will determine if there's an impact. Is it a qualified historical building? Is it a significant building? Are we dealing with a character-defining feature that will be lost? And therefore, rather than complying with regular code, we are allowed to look at alternative measures. First and most important, comply with regular code when you can without destroying historic character. Now, working through the provisions in Chapter 8.6, and there are not that many actually, that now we're going from somewhat performance-oriented to more prescriptive-oriented. We're given some alternatives to look at for entrances where a change in a main entrance would result in loss of historic character. First, access by the general public no further than 200 feet from the primary entrance. So using as an entrance that's accessible something that's not the main entrance. 2, access at any entrance not used by the general public, but open and unlocked with directional signs. Note directional signs at the primary entrance and as close as possible to, but no further than 200 feet. And 3, providing a notification system. Where security is a problem, remote monitoring may be used. If the alternative accessible entrance is not the main entrance, but let's say it's a side or rear door that's normally locked for safety reasons, that is of no use at all to a person who needs to use the alternative entrance. I've provided a sample of a directional sign, which is the first project where I was faced with this issue, and then these rules, which sound like bureaucracy on paper, you realize are very practical issues. If you arrive in a wheelchair at the main entrance to the building, and there's an alternative entrance for you that doesn't have steps, how do you know that there's an alternative entrance, and how do you know how to get there? This is a very simple diagram that works in this context to show you that from the point where you are, there's an entrance on the rear of the building. And in this case, I might add, there is Braille, and there is Spanish, and there is Spanish Braille as well. Accessibility for doors. Alternatives listed in priority. A single leaf door which provides a minimum of 30 inches clear opening. I'm going to illustrate the meaning of clear opening in just a moment. Secondly, a minimum of 29.5 inches clear opening. And third, double door, one leaf of which provides a minimum 29.5 inches clear opening, or double doors operable with a power assist that provides a minimum of 29.5 inches clear opening when both doors are in the open position. Not arbitrary numbers. These numbers have been studied carefully. They're less than normal code. Normal code numbers are good numbers. If we're usually talking about, in these circumstances, people with limited mobility, wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and when we get down to 29.5 inches, we may be just barely getting by. In a chair, the outside wheel-to-wheel dimension. If your knuckles are on the handrest, or your knuckles are moving the wheels, are you going to scrape your knuckles? To provide accessibility and safety, these are important and real numbers, and the wider the opening, the better. To illustrate the meaning of clear opening, we have a tape to the doorstop and to the corner of the door swung open. So this dimension is not finished frame opening, it's the actual clear opening. The functional opening, what is the widest point at which you can pass through the door? And that is often less than the framed clear opening. In this case, which is a historic mahogany door and frame in a qualified historical building, we have about 32.5 inches. So if we had to use those alternative measures, we would be more than 29.5, more than 30 inches. In this case, in the same building, we have double leaf doors that are 24 inches or wide each. And here we do not comply. A person in a wheelchair, practically speaking, could not get through this opening because we have a little over 24 inches clear. We would have to open both leaves of the door and or provide an automatic opener, really to provide access for that person through this doorway. Power-assisted doors are an equivalent alternatives. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, they solve problems. Level landings, strike side clearances, the forces of doors, these are all very practical requirements in the code to allow a person approaching a door to be able to operate and open that door. If we go mechanical, then if the push button is properly located, then if a person can approach a door without quite a level landing briefly and push that button, they can pass through the door. From an architect standpoint, I wanted to illustrate that the addition of mechanical equipment and electrical controls and buttons is not necessarily pretty. Our higher moral imperative is to provide access. Our secondary requirement as historic architects is, can we do this in character? Can we hide the electrical conduits that are the control, allowing us to control the door? Can we put those in walls? Or we're going to make more damage by cutting holes in walls, but ultimately we have to plan for this, and it's expensive. Toilet rooms. No illustration here, but to say that if we had a male and or female single accommodation or multiple accommodation toilet, and it did not provide accessible toilet facilities, we could consider, if there were a historic character issue, adding another unisex toilet facility that is accessible in an area, hopefully, that is of low impact to historic character. Exterior ramps and lifts and interior. The alternative to a conforming ramp is, first of all, a lift or ramp of greater than standard slope, but no greater than 1 in 10, for horizontal distances not to exceed 5 feet. So the ramp would be steeper than a regular code ramp, but it's also maximum distance shorter, 5 feet. And note, signs posted. You're given a warning that this is a steeper ramp, it may require more effort, and you have to be able if you're going to undertake this. Access by ramps 1 and 6, quite steep, but not to exceed 13 inches, just barely over 1 foot. That is a very short and very steep ramp, and if you've ever been in a wheelchair or you've seen this application of a ramp, you know that it creates a situation that is not as safe and easy as a regular ramp. First of all, here's an example of a conforming ramp addition that's in a reversible situation at the main entrance to a historic adobe building. Great lengths were made to make it compatible, reversible, but also to provide access, because this is a building that's visited by tens of thousands of people a year, including many, many school kids. Such a public building, we want to, if we possibly can, provide regular accessibility. On the other hand, while we had some new accessible toilets, we had non-conforming thresholds at an existing toilet where we added a steep ramp, but we added the warning that there's an excessive slope there. So if a person who's a wheelchair user approaches that, they're warned. They don't just come up on a 1 in 6 ramp and get surprised and possibly roll over backwards. The concept of equivalent facilitations, use of other designs or technology environments are permitted if the application of the alternative provisions contained would threaten or destroy character. Alternatives are applied only on item-by-item or case-by-case basis. They are provided by experiences, services, functions, materials, and resources through methods including but not limited to maps, plans, videos, virtual reality, and related equipment at accessible levels. So we're now getting into quickly changing technology that can give all of us, including people who may not, for example, be able to access a second level in a historic house museum, some way to learn and experience that space. Third item under equivalent facilitation. The official charged with the enforcement of the standards shall document the reasons and their effect on historical significance or character-defining features. It must be documented that there's an impact and therefore a justification. Documentation shall be in accordance with item 2 above and shall include the opinion and comments of state or local accessibility officials and the opinion and comments of representative local groups of people with disabilities. Many cities have accessibility commissions. Some cities have, in addition or aside from, local nonprofit or advocacy or educational groups of people with disabilities who should weigh in, who should be consulted. Our first case study is in Pueblo De Los Angeles, an area, particular building that was first constructed in 1875, but has had many alterations and additions. In this site plan of the park, this irregular building that I'm pointing to with the cursor is the winery building. We have archival drawings and a historic structure report that determines which parts of this are defining and which aren't. Therefore, we have some basis for making decisions. These are the archival drawings, and an as found floor plan shows a particular suite here, and this is actually the only really character-defining part of this building. Even though much of its shell goes back to 1875, very little except for the brick walls from the inside, except for the suite, and see a character-defining material or space. We have accessibility problems here. There's stairs at a main entrance, more stairs in the major passageway that gives access to tenant spaces, and 2 steps at another entrance. There are also steps within a restaurant space that is used by many people who visit as tourists and locals. The solution here, which was an interior addition, was an architectural interior design solution placed in such an area where there was no historic fabric that solved a lot of problems in terms of providing accessible toilet facilities, dressing rooms, and providing access, mobile access for wheelchairs to many different floors of the building. First of all, in the passageway where there was basically no historic fabric, we intervened by adding a ramp and adding a mechanical lift where these stairs are located. This darker double line here represents a very long corridor with ramps and landings that provides access to a number of different levels within the building. That ramp space is entered by this large landing space. It ramps down to the entrance to toilets and dressing rooms. It ramps down again to the other sex's toilet and dressing rooms. Then it ramps down to the main floor level through an existing doorway in this historic office suite. Next, there's another ramp that enters through an existing doorway into a lower level of this historic office suite. And finally, it ramps down to a landing at sidewalk level. The reason to go to these great extents for this office suite is, as you can see, was a very interesting 1930s winery support offices, interesting decorative materials where putting new openings in walls and adding ramps and lifts would have been a material and visual impact on this suite, but we accomplished an alternative path through existing doors without any interventions within the historic area itself. Case study number 2 is for a historic library building that is now on the campus of the University of Southern California. Stoops Hall was, in the first instance in the 1920s, the City of Los Angeles Public Library, then later became the property of the university. In the meantime, it has served as offices and as a departmental library for the university. And most recently, it's been adaptively reused for a new university club, which is a private faculty club. That main entrance with the stairway, of course, is a major concern. And this is the status in 1922. We have good archival photo documentation, so we can, on the interior and exterior, easily read what parts of this building are historic and significant and which are not. For better or worse, a new rail line has been added in the USC area on Exposition Park, and accidents do happen, but fortunately the building wasn't damaged, only the Model T. And here's our first challenge. How do we get people in and out of the main entrance? And here the decision was made by the University of Southern California that even if there is a way, and there could be another way to use an alternative entrance, that being in the role that they have of accommodating students, visitors, and faculty, they insisted that the main entrance needed to be the entrance for everyone. The site plan of the solution, which is an approach that is conceptually not that unusual, is to add a ramp which starts at the point where everybody enters the main building. It takes a path, contours, and landscaping to get to the landing level at the threshold of the main entrance. And the stairway, which was under this covered entrance, is now moved out. We'll see a detail of that. In addition to this building is the commercial food preparation facility and loading dock. So the historic building is the dining area and the bar, whereas the addition is all of the back of house. This ramp also leads to an exterior terrace, and there's also an accessible path that leads to a side door to the kitchen area. On the opposite side of the building, there's an accessible ramp that can take you from the sidewalk up along to the face of the addition, then back into an entrance here. This area that I'm pointing to is what we call a hyphen. If you go to Preservation Brief 43, it's a glazed area that separates the old building and articulates the new building. Within the addition, there is an elevator, and there are accessible bathrooms. The impact on the character and the spatial configuration of the interior of the historic library space is lessened by putting the new accessible facilities by way of elevator and toilets in the addition rather than in the historic building. A little bit easier to read here on the landscape plan. We have ramps that lead up to coming in on the side of an extended landing and continue to an outdoor terrace, and then continue to the kitchen facility, and a ramp on this side that leads from the public sidewalk up to a rear entrance. On the first floor, the main level, it's a little bit clearer that this is an elevator and these are the toilets. The detail through the main entrance is a reversible addition whereby we added new paving, raising the actual floor deck area to accessible threshold height and extending the landing out here, but maintaining the original stairs under there so that the historic fabric is encapsulated, and this is a substantially reversible addition. At the upper level, there's a mezzanine for private dining. That is accessible via this passageway and the new elevator, but the elevator is pulled into the addition rather than being located within the historic building. In our elevations, the historic building is on the left. This is the glazed hyphen, and
Peyton?
This is the addition, and this bump here is...
Peyton,
Yes.
can you highlight again at the spacing, the transition between the slides is a little bit of a delay. Can you highlight again where the historic and the hyphen?
Yes. The unpochade building on the left is the historic library building. I'm now pointing to the glazed hyphen, which is the connector between the old building to the left and the new building to the right. And at the bump up on the new building is the elevator override, just showing that the stairs and the elevators are in the new building, so there's no impact on the roof or walls or openings in the old building. And a rendering of the so-called hyphen. I hope the computer is caught up with the historic library building on the left, the glazed hyphen in the middle, the new addition on the right, and the elevator and stair tower rising above. And the end results, always prettier at night with a very nice lighting design. Looking at some helpers for mechanical devices. This is a device that's it's outdated, but it's one that I'm familiar with. All docents at the Gamble House are trained to use this. The blue device is actually holding onto a wheelchair. It's disconcerting because you have to lean way back in order to go up the stairs, but it works very effectively. I think there are devices now that can load your wheelchair upstairs without making you lean back so far that you feel like you're going to fall over. Recently I was at Crystal Cove State Park in Orange County, and just a delightful place, and was delighted to see that they have wheelchairs with big wheels just like this one. And if you prefer, a wheelchair with tracks, or wheelchairs that ride in the woods and in the water and on the sand. Some years ago, I was in Colonial Williamsburg, which is a large historic park with many historic buildings in the 1920s, and even the 1920s buildings now have been listed on the National Register. Colonial Williamsburg, for all of its good intentions in terms of historical education, was placed under a compliance order by the Department of Justice very early on after the passage of ADA, because they were not providing good access to their their visitors. I recommend, if you have time to go, take your family and friends to Colonial Williamsburg, and while they're enjoying the history, take a walking tour on your own and look at the various solutions they have come up with for ramps and mechanical devices to provide access to buildings that are not only from the 1920s, but in some cases have DNA that goes back to the 1700s. Since that time, technology, I think, has helped for all of us in letting us know more about the places we're going to visit. The Colonial Williamsburg website has a page on accessibility, and if you move down to the bottom of the page, they address different types of needs, not just mobility, such as visual impairments, hearing impairments, limited mobility. They list the wheelchair accessible restroom locations, tours, accessibilities for their trade shops. They have a lot of activities and retail there. And this is a not meant for reading, but this is a fold out of a map where there's not only a graphic representation of all the buildings and which areas are accessible, but a tabular list with all of those places and a description of what type of accessibility is provided. So this would be a really good example of how to give people information that will help them visit your site if they have disabilities. In coming close to the close, there's a provision of Chbc that speaks to alternative minimum standards. The alternative minimum standards for alterations of qualified historical buildings or facilities are contained in the stated section of ADA standards for accessible design, 28 CFR 36. So this is a clear connection between our state code and ADA. And that cross-reference, which I have quoted here, is a very short, simple list. Not that the summation of what we do in situations like this is simple, but here's the list. A, at least one accessible entrance. C, if toilets are provided, at least one toilet facility. D, accessible routes from an accessible entrance to all publicly used spaces on at least the level of the accessible entrance. And E, rules for displays and written information. I have used these alternative minimum requirements in a local jurisdiction Chbc application where it really helped me and helped the building official to clarify if we are adaptively reusing a Victorian house for an office, what should our approach be? What's the minimum we can do to make this work? And that is to get people to the front door, get them through the front door, provide them with a toilet, and provide them with ways to get to the publicly used spaces in the building. We hope it's a lot more than that, but we couldn't imagine having a building that is acceptable for people with disabilities without at least providing these things. Alterations to buildings or facilities that are eligible for listing are designated as historic under state or law. This is ADA. Shall comply to the maximum extent feasible with Appendix A. If it is determined that under the procedures set out that it is not feasible to provide physical access to a historic property, and we're now in an ADA environment, not Chbc code context, that is a place of public accommodation in a manner that will not threaten or destroy the historic significance of the building or facility. Alternative methods of access shall be provided pursuant. notice that under the second paragraph on this page, that in using these alternatives under AD with Chbc, and in this case, Chbc should be able to agree that the compliance would threaten or destroy the historical significance of the building or facility. So whereas in a local jurisdiction, we noted that usually your local building official and or plan checkers, preservation planners will need to be the ones who say that the impact on a historic feature is real, that it's in a ADA context, there's a reference to consulting with your state historic preservation officer. And that concludes the presentation for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Peyton. If the audience has any questions, please type them in at this time. Peyton, we've received a couple of questions, so I'm going to ask for your answers to these questions. The first one is that since the California building code does not apply to federal properties, is there any equivalent to the California Historical Building Code found in the IBC or NFPA?
Excuse me. I believe that in a federal jurisdiction that the last slide that I have here, really I'll go back to the next to the last slide. These are the provisions of ADA that reference historic buildings. What a qualified historical building is, what the alternatives are available for qualified historical buildings, and who makes that determination. So from my standpoint, and I welcome other information or points of view, because I'm not able to pull out, say, IBC or the International Code Family provisions for existing and historic buildings, that this is the federal regulatory context, and the jurisdiction for federal properties is obviously the federal regulations, not state or local regulations.
Okay, thank you. The second question, if multiple historic buildings occur on the same site which are being converted to residential use, does every building require an accessible entrance to the ground floor unit, even if the overall site has over 95% accessible units?
I would say this is case by case. In my experience, for example, in working with a garden apartment complex that has over 600 units, some in 1- and 2-story units that we're working with, and there's also HUD funding involved, in working with the local city's jurisdiction and HUD, that a certain number of units are provided that meet accessibility standards for housing, but not all of them. So I think it's in a case by case with a local jurisdiction, but my sense from experience is that it would not necessarily be required to have 100% of all living units be accessible.
Okay. This is a comment on one of the slides that you showed, Pate, one of the case studies at Stoops Hall. It says the solution to the entry at Stoops Hall to extend the entrance to accommodate an accessible ramp. That's the subject. However, preserving the old stair underneath the new entrance under the guise of reversibility is where preservation goes off the tracks for nearly anyone outside of the world of preservation. Care to comment on this? What was the decision process behind making that alteration?
The decision process was having the City of Los Angeles Office of Historic Resources jurisdiction over approving proposed work on a qualified historical building. In this case, it's a contribute to an eligible California registered district, and the challenge was to keep the historic fabric of the original stairway and to provide accessibility. And this was the solution that was arrived at by the architect and consultants in consultation with the city jurisdiction. I hope I answered the question.
Thanks. Please explain equivalent facilitation and the consultation with local groups. Is this consultation required every time alternatives are used?
I have found in my experience that that many very common or frequent issues of regular code versus alternative code are handled administratively by, for example, a local planner who writes a modification to the code and justifies a 29.5-inch opening versus a 36-inch wide opening, for example. But that in very more major issues like the main entrance to a building being an alternative, that particularly in a public facility, whether it be a city hall, a courthouse, even a historic train station or boarding area, that to provide an entrance alternatively for wheelchair users versus everybody is a really big important issue, and can and should be, in my experience, has been taken to, referred by the building official to a local review body by a commission with a public hearing opportunity so that the people can speak about their opinion about this equivalency or not.
Okay, next question is, when is it permissible to use hardware helpers, that is mechanical devices, to provide accessibility?
In a case like the Gamble House, we go back to, I go back in my thought process to the question of whether it's possible to provide under normal regulations accessibility to the first or second floor of a house without having a historic impact. And here in a National Historic Landmark, high status property with lots of stairs on all sides, there was a consensus in the city jurisdiction and the owner and the clients that the loss of historic fabric and historic visual character could not be abided, and therefore the only workable solution was to use a mechanical device. Not preferred, you know, it puts the building owner and the wheelchair user in an awkward position, not to be, you know, self-mobile to get to the front door. So in other circumstances, so that's a fallback. So it's a way to solve a big problem. Other issues, like I would say the big wheel chairs at Crystal Cove, is more, isn't this wonderful that we found a way that a lot of different people can use the beach, and therefore it's all positive when we sometimes find solutions that are just I think smart, not terribly. They're not electronic or mechanical. They just allow more people to enjoy more experiences.
Okay, just another question is, why does only the first or original format of the building have value, and therefore all other remodels, which may also be historical, have no value? If remodels have been done throughout a building's life, why not try to save as many aspects as possible?
I agree entirely, and part of the homework for getting to justifying what's saved and what isn't is in the best of all worlds, completing a historic structure report for every building before you touch it, so that you know what is significant and what isn't. If you take the Rose Bowl, for example, the first construction took place, or rather was completed, on the Rose Bowl site in 1922. Alterations and additions have continued since 1922 and are underway today. In the case of the Rose Bowl, a historic structure report that's now about 15 years old determined that its period of significance extended from 1922 to 1950, which was the era of work by a very important architect, Myron Hunt, on the property. And it's also coincident with the era in which most of the parts of the Rose Bowl came into being. Now, would you re-examine that 50 years from now and say, well, maybe we should extend that period of significance and other important things have happened? Perhaps yes. But the answer is, I agree. Do the homework and know what's significant. And it's not necessarily first construction. It may be other changes that have acquired significance over time.
Okay. Does the California Historical Building Code apply to other types of regulations, such as water conservation, restriction of lawns, fire setback guidelines for vegetation?
It is a little beyond my expertise. The answer is, I think, is a tentative yes. That across other, at least state ordinances and rules, this opens the door for consideration. And perhaps not answering completely, but going to Chapter 8-10, Qualified Historical District Sites and Open Spaces, is useful because it's pretty comprehensive, I think, in this chapter's breadth in extending the discussion beyond building footprint to open spaces, curbs, sidewalks, gutters, the yard, the outdoor spaces in a district, the settings of buildings.
Yes, and that's actually a very good segue for our next session, which will be on accessibility and historic landscapes. Another question is, if an applicant disagrees with the interpretation of the California Historical Building Code by the local agency, is the SHPO the agency designated to rule on the local agency's interpretation?
No, under Section 8-104, Review and Appeals, the State Historical Building Safety Board shall act as an appeal and review body to state and local agencies or any affected party. So there's that process is outlined in CHBC, and if you contact their staff, they would be happy to tell you more about how to do that. I believe the board in the past has met about once a quarter. There's substantial preparation required. So you have to really want to do this and be persistent and have some lead time to effect an appeal.
Good. We have one last question, and is there a weight limit for accessible entrance doors?
In terms of the way to operate the door, if there's a, I don't know what the weight limit is. It makes a great deal of sense to me, just as using automatic openers, that if a door needs to be accessible and is too heavy to operate, that an automatic mechanical door opener essentially solves the same problem, not just of having, say, a problem of the operating hardware or the strike side, but it overcomes the weight of the door by opening it for you automatically.
Okay, well, we have no other questions, so I would like to thank you, Peyton, for leading this webinar today. I'd like to thank everyone who attended this webinar for joining us today. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar and recommendations for future topics. I will also send an email with the final PowerPoint presentation. We hope that you'll join us for the last 2 webinars in this year's State Historical Building Code series. Information on how to register for the last webinars will be sent to you. You all have a good afternoon, and we look forward to for you to participate in the next webinar series. Thank you.